My name is Chirath Easwarage, and from this video series, we are going to cover a segment that many students find hard to understand and also to answer questions from. That is the sexual reproduction cycles of terrestrial plants, or simply plant life cycles. So under this, we are going to have a small introduction about how this alternation of generations or life cycles happen. And then under your non-vascular seedless plants, we have Pogonatum life cycle to do under phylum Bryophyta. Then under your vascular but seedless plants, we have two phyla to cover, that is phylum Pterophyta, under which we have to know the Neprolepis life cycle, and then under phylum Lycophyta, we have to know the Selaginella life cycle. Then when we come to seed plants, we have two categories as gymnosperms and angiosperms. Under gymnosperms, we have the Cycas life cycle from phylum Cycadophyta, and from your flowering plants or angiosperms or anthophytes, we have a typical flowering plant life cycle to do, right? Okay, first of all, let's have a small introduction about how a typical life cycle takes place and the keywords we have to know, right? So, in this life cycles, we have two generations, which is known as heteromorphic alternation of generations. There's a sporophyte and a gametophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte is our diploid organism or the diploid generation, right? And the gametophyte is your haploid generation. Okay, so this diploid and haploid refers to the ploidy level or the presence of a maternal and paternal chromosome set. So if the both sets are there, we call it as a diploid organism. If only one set is there, we call it as a haploid organism, right? So the sporophytic generation produces spores, which is the dispersal unit, right? And the spores are haploid. So in order to produce a haploid cell, the sporophyte will undergo meiotic cell division, right? Meiotic cell division. And these produced spores will undergo germination, that is indicated by this mitosis, right? Cell division, and will produce the next generation or the haploid generation, the gametophyte. Gametophyte is going to produce gametes. So gametes are N, right? See, so that means the gametes produced by the gametophyte are also haploid. So that can be done by meiosis, right? So gamete from one gametophyte and gamete from another gametophyte, we call them male and female gametophytes. When they combine, we call that process fertilization. And that fertilization will produce a single cell that is diploid. We call it as the zygote. The zygote will grow into a mature sporophyte. This is the basic idea. Okay. Now we can read what is there in the resource, right? So as it mentions, there's alternation of generations in all land plants, and there's a haploid generation and a diploid generation, right? So there's a haploid gametophyte and a diploid sporophyte, which are morphologically different. That's why we call it heteromorphic alternation. When we look at the external appearance, we can clearly identify separately that this is the gametophyte and this is the sporophyte. That's what that's why we call it heteromorphic alteration of generation. And then there's another set of terms that we have to know. The reproductive organs of your sporophyte is known as sporangia, right? And the reproductive organs of your gametophyte is known as gametangia. If the gametangia is male, that is going to produce male gametes, it has a separate name. We call it an antheridium, antheridium single. Okay, and if the gametangia is female, we call it as an archegonium. Female gametangia is known as archegonium, right? So antheridium is going to produce male gametes, which are sperms, right? And the archegonium is going to produce female gametes, which are eggs. Okay, right. Then let's continue. Then what the next key thing you have to know, all land plants carry out internal fertilization. Internal fertilization is an evolutionary trend to protect the zygote produced, right? So in order to carry out internal fertilization, always the female gamete or the egg is going to be retained in the archegonium. So if the egg is retained, the sperm has to come and find it, right? Therefore, the male gametes will be released from the antheridium, right? And they will come into the archegonium to fertilize. The seedless plants will depend on external water for fertilization. That means the seedless plants produce motile sperms that has the ability to move, right? So they will move through external water and come into the archegonium and find the egg and fertilize it. But seed plants do not depend on external water. We'll learn this when you are doing the life cycle of seed plants, because seed plants has a structure called a pollen tube. Okay, a pollen tube to deliver the sperms directly into the egg. Okay, so after fertilization, as I mentioned, a diploid zygote is produced and it is retained within the female gametophyte, okay, to produce an embryo which is going to be nourished by the gametophyte. So the embryo will develop into a diploid sporophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte will produce spores by meiosis. Spores are haploid, remember. Then the spores will go into, again, haploid gametophytes, right? And the evolutionary trend is for the gametophytes to become gradually smaller and dependent on the sporophyte. And when we come to your flowering plants, you will see that the gametophyte is actually very microscopic and entirely dependent on the sporophyte, right? On the other hand, the sporophyte will gradually become dominant and also the macroscopic generation, the generation that we can see in the environment. That is the evolutionary trend. Okay, that also you have to keep in mind. With that, we are done with the basic introduction. Now we can move on to the first life cycle under phylum Bryophyta. We have to talk about the life cycle of Pogonatum. Right? With this diagram, I'll first go through what actually happens. Then we can go through what is there in the resource book under evolution and also plant form and function as well. Right? So let's start with here. This female gametophyte. When we are talking about Pogonatum, we have to mention that one of the most important features or distinctive features is that the gametophyte is the dominant generation, right? So this part is the gametophyte. You can see it is photosynthetic and it has what we call as rhizoids, right? Rhizoids are not what we call as proper roots that we can find in vascular plants, right? Rhizoids are simply there to anchor the plant and it doesn't have proper vascular tissue development as in proper roots, right? I'll explain what rhizoids are in detail. So these are rhizoids and this is the mature gametophyte that is actually the dominant stage, right? Then the gametophyte, on top of the gametophyte, we can see the sporophyte, right? As you can see, the sporophyte is not green colored and it is permanently attached to the gametophyte, right? That means the sporophyte is completely dependent on your gametophyte for its nutrition, right? So the sporophyte has three parts as the seta, the capsule and the foot. So through the foot it is attached to the gametophyte and the capsule is the name we give to the sporangium. So sporangium is what? The reproductive organs of the sporophyte, right? So the sporangium or the capsule will produce spores and right through the cell division meiosis, right? When the capsule becomes mature, it has sort of a lid and when that lid falls off, the spores will be released, right? And in the developmental stage of your Pogonatum, the spores that are released has a developmental stage called protonemata. Right, protonemata, they have these unicellular filament-like structures, right, that are optimized for maximum surface area to obtain proper nutrition, enough nutrition for it to grow into the gametophyte. So remember, protonemata is an important term and a stage to remember, right? So we say in Pogonatum, the gametophyte is dioecious, right, or unisexual. There are two separate male and female gametophytes, right? So first we will consider the male gametophyte, right? So the male gametophyte has gametangia. So the male gametangia we call as antheridia, right? So antheridia is going to produce sperm, right? So as I mentioned, all terrestrial plants have internal fertilization. Therefore, the sperm must travel to the egg in order to perform fertilization. Let's move on to the female gametophyte. So the female gametangia are known as archegonia, and within each archegonium you can see there's going to be an egg, right? And the egg is going to be retained, as you can see, within the archegonium. Fertilization is happening because the egg is retained without releasing to the outside, right? And here the sperm must swim through a film of moisture to reach the egg, right? This means this is what you can see. This is external water, right? External water, right? That is a unique feature, right? This dependence of sperm on external water for fertilization is a feature that will be lost with evolution. When we come to seed plants, this feature will be lost. Okay, and this sperm actually reaches the egg due to certain chemical attractants released by the archegonium itself. Right. So movement of sperm towards the archegonium and the egg due to these chemical attractants has a name called chemotaxis. It's not in your resource, but it's the proper term, right? Then within the archegonium, fertilization takes place. So the egg and the sperm combine to form your diploid zygote, right? And the diploid zygote then becomes an embryo, right? The embryo will start to develop into a young sporophyte, right? As you can see, it is the sporophyte attached by its foot remains nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte, right? So in here, in the mature stage, you can see the sporophyte is on top of the gametophyte, completely dependent on it for nutrition. Okay, that is the diagrammatic representation. Now we can move on to read the resource, right? I'll first go through what is in evolution under phylum Bryophyta. So the example given is Pogonatum, right? So phylum Bryophytes, or we called as mosses as the common term, right? Common in moist terrestrial places. As I mentioned earlier, they rely on external water for fertilization. Therefore, in order to have external water for fertilization, their habitat must be a place with water, right? So they usually grow in moist terrestrial places. Then the haploid gametophyte is the dominant stage, as I mentioned. It is photosynthetic, so it can produce its own food, and it is independent, right? The gametophyte has leaves, stems, and rhizomes. As you can see, they are mentioned within inverted commas, right? That means they are not proper stems or leaves, because in the definition of stems and leaves, we use the stems and leaves that we can see in vascular plants, right? So since these are not vascular plants, we do not consider them to have proper stems and leaves. And also, instead of roots, they have rhizomes. Okay, so this is what I mentioned. The gametophyte is dioecious. The other term we use for this is unisexual, right? Unisexual. There's a separate male and a female gametophyte. And male plant produces flagellated sperm in antheridia, extra film of water. And sporophyte is green and photosynthetic when young, but it will remain attached to the gametophyte and absorb nutrients and water from the female gametophyte. That indicates their dependency on the female gametophyte. Okay. So all terrestrial plants usually have stomata for gas exchange and also transpiration. And homosporous. This is a very, very, very important point. Pogonatum is homosporous, usually asked in A-level paper as well. You can see, right? The spores produced by the sporangium are similar to each other, right? Homosporous. That means all spores are morphologically similar to each other. The opposite term for this is what? Heterosporous. That means if the spores are morphologically different to each other. Okay. Then we can move on to the description in your plant form under Pogonatum, right? So it's usually the same thing. Gametophyte is dominant, gametophyte is photosynthetic, stems, leaves, and rhizoids on the gametophyte. Gametophyte is dioecious or unisexual, right? It's the same story. And a single egg is produced within each archegonium, and the egg is not released because it is undergoing internal fertilization. The sperms are flagellated and motile, right? Entering the archegonium in response to chemical attractants. That is what I mentioned earlier, the process known as chemotaxis, right? So within the archegonium, there's going to be fertilization happening. Embryo is also retained, that is arising from the zygote, right? It's going to develop into the sporophyte. The sporophyte remains attached to the gametophyte and remains attached to the gametophyte through the foot, right? So the seta is sort of the connection between foot and the capsule. Capsule is what? Yeah, sporangium. The functions of the foot is mentioned here. It absorbs nutrients and water. The capsule is your sporangium and it produces homospores, right? Homosporous. And if the spores are dispersed to a favorable habitat, it is growing into that branch filament I mentioned. It's a developmental stage called protonema, right? Or protonemata, either way, right? The protonema will grow into the male and female gametophyte. Then we can move on to the life cycle of Neprolepis, which is under phylum Pterophyta, which are again seedless but vascular plants, right? Let's quickly go through this diagram first to get a rough idea. Then we can go through what is there in the resource book, right? So this is your sporophyte. So as I mentioned, the evolutionary trend is for gradually the sporophyte to become dominant and the gametophyte to become dependent on the sporophyte and also become very, very small and at the end microscopic, right? So here, that according to that evolutionary trend, this sporophyte is the dominant stage of the life cycle, right? These fiddleheads is the name we give for young leaves, yeah. And the mature leaves are what we call as compound leaves, right? They are compound leaves. And there's a unique feature in this Neprolepis that the sporangia is borne as clusters on the underside of the leaf, which are known as sorus, singular sorus, plural sori, right? So this is that such a sorus, right? So the sorus contains a cluster of sporangia, okay, right? So the sporangia, actually the sporangia, the spore producing mother cells are covered by a layer called the indusium, and when that indusium layer dries up and shrivels, the spores will be released like this, right? The spores are going to germinate into the gametophyte, and this gametophyte is also unique because it is what we called as a bisexual gametophyte, right? Both male and female gametes are produced in the same gametophyte, okay? That means both male and female gametangia are produced or born on the same plant or the same gametophyte, okay? So we know the male gametophyte, so gametangia is known as antheridium. It is going to produce sperm, and the female gametangia is the archegonium. It is going to produce an egg that is retained within the archegonium. And you can see this is an external water film. The sperm is going to swim through it because the sperm is flagellated, and it's going to come into the archegonium and it's going to fertilize the egg, right? Right. The fertilization will produce a zygote, and that zygote will become an embryo, and the embryo will obtain nutrition from the gametophyte, which is bisexual, remember, and it will grow obtaining nutrients from the gametophyte, and it will grow into a new sporophyte, right? The gametophyte will provide nourishment until it is ready to be a mature sporophyte. So this is the diagrammatic overall idea, right? Then we can move on to what is there in the resource book. Okay. Life cycle of Neprolepis. So as I mentioned, the evolutionary trend is for the sporophyte to become dominant. So it is now dominant, and the gametophyte has become reduced and short-lived, right? But as that can be seen in this diagram, the gametophyte is still green colored, right? Green color means it is photosynthetic. Being photosynthetic makes the gametophyte independent. It can make its own food, right? So this is a description of your sporophyte, right? It is now, since it is a vascular plant, we consider it to have proper roots, stems and leaves, right? And a cuticle is found on aerial parts, as we know, right? Almost all aerial plants have a cuticle. Stomata is there on all terrestrial plants, and evolutionary, the vascular plants have xylem and phloem as their vascular tissues, and young leaves are known as fiddleheads, a key term to remember, right? And the stem is an underground stem, right, called a rhizome, right? And the leaves are compound leaves, as I mentioned earlier. So asexual reproduction can take place through new plantlets that can arise from this underground stem, right? These underground branches are called stolones. These are all keywords. Then this sori, right, which is a unique feature. Sori, they can ask you in the structure essay paper, they are clusters of sporangia on the underside of mature leaflets. Okay, and the sori are covered by the indusium. So they can ask you what is the function of indusium, that is protecting young sporangia from desiccation, from being dried out, right? Then we know spores are getting produced by the cell division meiosis, and they are homospores. All spores are similar to each other, right? So you can see spores are similar to each other. So when this indusium, which is a protective layer, dries up, right, it will shrivel and it will expose the mature sporangia, and from the sporangium, when the sporangium wall ruptures, spores will be released. Spores are wind dispersed, right? And when they are usually dispersed to favorable habitat, they will grow into a gametophyte, right? Now this is a description of your gametophyte here, right? Gametophyte is heart-shaped, macroscopic, green color and photosynthetic. It's called as a thallus because it does not have proper tissues per se. Like a proper plant, it does not have tissue organization, so we consider it as a mass of cells or a thallus, right? So it has rhizoids only, not proper roots, right? Similar to bryophytes, it has rhizoids. Then this is a very unique feature. We consider the Neprolepis gametophyte to be bisexual, right? Because both antheridia and archegonia are developed on the same plant, right? Then the sperms are flagellated, right? The archegonium produces egg and retains it. The sperms are motile, right? So they can swim through external water in response to chemical attractants known as chemotaxis, right? So fertilization results in a diploid zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo, right? The embryo becomes the young sporophyte, which will obtain nutrients from the gametophyte, right? So all developmental stages are nourished by the gametophyte.